I'm Slava Zilba. Welcome to Conversations with Slava. Thank you for supporting this show on Patreon. You're keeping it independent and sustainable. Today, I'm talking to investigative journalist Alex Rubinstein. You write his long history of misleading the American public or getting things completely wrong remains unscrutinized until now. Many will be surprised to find out that you are talking about Dr. Anthony Fauci, Director of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. Why are you qualified to make this statement, Alex?
Well, I'm no medical expert, but I'll say that the reason that I got into journalism circa 2014 was because I was encountering in my experience a lot of lies coming from the media and a lot of misinformation. And so since then, for the past years, I've tried to help people with their media literacy. And I've tried to uncover information that has been ignored or lied about by the mainstream media. And I think that in this case, Dr. Fauci is a very good example of media distortion.
When you write about his long history of misleading the American public or getting things completely wrong, what do you mean? In your article, Saint Anthony Fauci, The Hidden History, what the media won't tell you about Dr. Anthony Fauci, you address his responses to the diseases AIDS, cholera, and COVID-19. Please explain.
Well, to begin, Anthony Fauci's comments on the virus early on really downplayed the severity. Repeatedly, he told Americans that it wasn't necessary to wear masks, that there was no reason to wear masks. He's also, said initially that it would require 60% of the population to be immune to the coronavirus in order for it to die out and for us to have herd immunity. He's now upped that to as high as 90%, and he's even told the New York Times that he did that based off of polling. So it was a political assessment, not as much as a scientific assessment, and it was in fact misleading. He also said that his claim that masks weren't necessary were so that first responders would have access to personal protective equipment. I think that is a little bit justifiable. However, I think it's wrong as the most trusted man in the United States on the coronavirus to mislead the public. You can tell them not to go out and get masks because it will create a shortage. But I think it's wrong to lie and say that it's not necessary, and it creates a certain amount of skepticism in the public's eye about this virus. You know, if you had Anthony Fauci saying the things that he said, at the beginning of the pandemic today on YouTube, that would be grounds for censorship. That's what I told another show that I just did an interview for. And really, I mean, as I say in my article, Anthony Fauci, it seems, was given some kind of vaccine against criticism. He's totally immune to it at this point. And he's got a long history as the national leader on infectious and viral diseases. I talk a lot about his handling of the AIDS crisis, and I'm happy to break that down, as well as his handling of cholera in Haiti. I don't know which you would prefer me to start with.
Please address both situations, and why has there been no accountability?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, I think that it's uncommon in the United States for there to be much accountability for any politicians. But in the Trump era, Anthony Fauci has been particularly shielded, I think, because his character and demeanor provides a stark contrast with the typically bombastic President Trump. And so even though he's been by his side throughout the handling of the pandemic, he's been kind of propped up as I call him Saint Anthony Fauci, to make Trump look bad. So if you go back to the early 1980s, Fauci was a major proponent of this theory of HIV, AIDS, which was called the 4 H's. And basically those H's stood for heroin addicts, hemophiliacs, homosexuals, and Haitians. And each of those categories supposedly constituted a separate risk group. And Fauci repeated this line throughout his handling of the AIDS crisis. And it's really been discredited since. In particular, specifically the Haitians. There's no reason to believe that Haitians constituted a separate risk group. There was a high degree of AIDS in Haitian communities, and we can talk about that too. It had to do with predatory practices of Western companies in Haiti. There, for example, there was a company called Caribbean, I believe, if I remember correctly. And what this company did is it paid Haitians, cash-strapped Haitians, for blood samples and carcasses and things like that. But they didn't use sanitary measures. For example, they wouldn't change needles in between blood draws. So there was a high degree of AIDS in Haitian communities, but Haitians were getting it for all the same reasons that anybody else may have gotten. And Fauci was never really held to account on that. The other thing about the AIDS crisis and Fauci's handling of it was that in 1983, he put out an editorial that was based off of, basically there were the American Medical Association was conducting studies on a group of children that had contracted AIDS. We're talking under 1 year old. And there were two competing narratives about how they had gotten AIDS. One, which was based on science and rigorous research, was that they had gotten it from their mother's blood while still in the uterus. The other line was that they had gotten it through household contact, which was not really scientifically grounded. It was more of a sensationalist story, as much of the reporting at the time on HIV/AIDS was. Now, Fauci didn't really engage in either of those studies, but what he did do is that he wrote an editorial in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a very influential medical journal, that promoted this idea of household contact spreading AIDS. And really what this did was it unleashed a wave of hysteria across the United States. There were all kinds of calls because of it to have gay pride parades canceled. There were calls to have food handlers screened for HIV/AIDS, all kinds of authoritarian measures. And people, it's important to note that the scientific consensus was already that HIV/AIDS was spread through blood and semen, basically. And so what this did is it really turned back the dial on AIDS awareness. And Fauci didn't read the studies that were being published in the same publication that he was writing for that said that, it was spread through blood in the uterus. And it created an environment of fear around not only AIDS patients, but also Haitians, since they were considered a separate risk group. So, you have people getting fired or laid off because, people are afraid of getting AIDS from them. And really just mass hysteria around the crisis. I mean, this was killing people rapidly, very quickly, and it was they're ugly deaths. And the public naturally didn't want to get that virus. But what Fauci did with this editorial is he spread a lot of fear that average people could get the virus, whether you're the guy who makes your pizza that you get delivered has AIDS. You don't know. So it was a disastrous editorial. I should also note that it was the year after he put out this flawed editorial that he was promoted to the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
And he has kept that position ever since.
For nearly 40 years.
How fair is it to refer to him as a politician, as you do in that article, not just comparing him to one, but referring to him as one?
Well, I think that he is a scientist. He has done a number of medical journals, but he has also been the public face of, one, the coronavirus, two, HIV/AIDS, and he was also very influential in U.S. policy on things like H1N1, for example. So, when he's gauging, I go back to the herd immunity issue, where he was gauging U.S. public opinion on vaccination to tailor his scientific assessment, what should have been his scientific assessment, to what's acceptable to the public. And I really believe that is a political action and not a scientific action. The scientists would say, well, it should be 85 to 90%, if that's truly what the scientific consensus is. But that's not what he was saying. He was saying 60% because the acceptance of vaccines was very low in the public eye. And he has longstanding ties to every administration since Ronald Reagan, longstanding ties to the Clinton. And if you look at how he was talking about the cholera outbreak in Haiti, I think that's another great example of him being political rather than scientific. So, on January 12th of 2010, there was that devastating earthquake in Haiti. And less than a month later, on February 1st, he went on the National Institute of Health radio and declared that there was no risk of cholera in Haiti, which was wrong. Of course, there was a massive cholera outbreak that killed thousands of people and infected hundreds of thousands. But around the time when Haitians started to grow wise to the source of the outbreak, which was a United Nations aid mission in Haiti that was using unsanitary waste management practices, Fauci came out and told CNN that basically cholera already existed in Haiti, which contradicted his previous statements. And this was the same exact day that the United Nations was putting out its first press releases denying culpability. So he really ran cover for the UN and the Clintons, who were heavily involved in the relief effort in Haiti at the time.
In light of everything you have just told me, what is the message of your article?
Well, I think that the US public should be more critical of the people who the media tells us we need to anoint. I think that if Anthony Fauci's record had been more critically analyzed in the beginning of the pandemic, maybe he wouldn't have been leading the US response, and maybe we wouldn't be seeing 3,000 plus deaths per day and nearly 400,000 people dead so far. I mean, you look at China, which has, 4,000 deaths total, and we're getting nearly that per day. It's been a disastrous response, and Trump has gotten the entirety of the blame for it. Meanwhile, the person leading Trump's task force and who's going to lead a Biden administration's task force has been totally unscrutinized. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think the goal of my article was to raise awareness around that issue.
Why has he remained unscrutinized? It goes beyond his contrast to Trump, doesn't it?
Well, it's tough to say. I think that there's the liberal consensus of trust the experts and all that, but no, I believe that most of this has been because he provides a contrast to Trump, because he's a much more measured person. So it's somebody close to him that the U.S. public is supposed to look to for guidance while dismissing the president.
And what has the reaction to your article been How have social media companies responded? You mentioned YouTube censorship.
Well, I haven't been censored myself. I was only referring to, the interview I did with the Convo Couch the other day. They made a very good point about how COVID-19 has been used to suppress speech online. And so I was only making a point about how Anthony Fauci, the expert, his views have been so wrong on it that they would fall afoul of guidelines on social media.
And the responses to your article from the general public, from people in the medical field?
Well, I haven't seen too much. The thing is that I published that article as the first for my Substack, which is Real Alex Ruby, RUBI. And so hasn't been a huge audience to actually see it. It only has a few thousand reads. So I would appreciate any viewers of your show coming over to see it or subscribing to my Substack. But I have noticed that some people who have subscribed to my Substack have .edu email addresses. So hopefully it's making some rounds in academic circles.
Thank you for this interview, Alex.